Some betrayals don't cut loud. They bleed quiet. And sometimes the silence hurts worse than the blade. My name is Alma Louise Carter. I am 67 years old, born and raised in Mississippi, though I've lived most of my adult life up here in Ohio. Folks at church call me Mother Carter, not just because of my age, but because I've spent my life looking after people, family, neighbors, even strangers when they needed a warm meal or a steady prayer. I buried my first husband when I was 38, raised our only daughter with a backbone of faith and Sunday dinners. Then, years later, I remarried. I believed I was building a second chapter on solid ground. But that evening, sitting in a hotel banquet room decorated with my daughter's college colors, I learned the foundation I'd trusted for over 2 decades was nothing but rotted wood. The dinner was supposed to be hers. My baby girl, Patrice, the first in our family to walk across a stage with a degree in her hand. I had ironed my best navy dress, the one with the pearl buttons, and set my church hat just so, though it wasn't a Sunday. The room smelled of roast chicken and buttered rolls. Laughter bounced off the walls, the kind of laughter that comes easy when people feel proud. Then my husband, Henry, stood. He cleared his throat like he was about to give a father's blessing, and I folded my napkin neat in my lap, waiting. But the words that rolled out of his mouth weren't pride. They were poison. "Tonight is," he said, "I'm also celebrating freedom. I've filed for divorce, and I'll be moving in with someone who truly understands me." I swear the air thinned. Forks froze mid-air, wine glasses trembled, and there, across from me at our daughter's table, sat a woman I'd only seen once before in passing, Henry's so-called coworker. She raised her glass, bold as brass, clinked it against his, and smiled like she'd already stolen everything worth having. Patrice gasped. My niece's mouth dropped open. Even the servers stopped moving, standing stiff with trays balanced in their hands. The room went stone still except for the sound of my own heartbeat knocking in my ears. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I leaned across the white tablecloth, close enough for only Henry to hear, and whispered, "Congratulations. You just failed your last test." His brows pinched, confused, like he didn't understand the language I was speaking. But I straightened my back, placed a small black flash drive on the table in front of him, and gathered my purse. I kissed my daughter's cheek, whispered that I loved her, and walked out of that banquet hall with my head held high, though my knees felt weak enough to buckle. The night air was cool, cutting through the warmth of the summer evening, and I let it carry me down the sidewalk. Behind me, voices rose, some calling my name, others murmuring questions, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. In that moment, I thought of my mother, God rest her soul. She used to tell me, "Alma, storms will come, but don't you ever let folks see you drown." So I put one foot in front of the other, breathing slow, reminding myself that dignity was my lifeline. When Henry slid that flash drive into his computer later that night, he would see the truth. Truth I had been collecting piece by piece for months, though even I hadn't wanted to believe it at first. Bank statements, receipts, messages. Proof that the man I trusted had been building a life behind my back, using my years of sacrifice as his stepping stone. But that part of the story comes later. Walking away from that dinner, all I carried was shock, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight for your bones. For 22 years, Henry had eaten at my table, prayed beside me at church, held my hand at funerals, laughed with me on porches. We had bought this house together, planted roses in the yard, scraped through lean years and celebrated fat ones, or so I thought. And yet, on the very night we were supposed to be honoring the daughter we raised, he chose to tear the veil off and show the ugliest truth of who he really was. I sat in my car outside that hotel for nearly 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching guests trickle out in silence. Nobody knew whether to comfort me or Patrice, or just scatter like roaches in the light. I didn't blame them. Betrayal makes a room unlivable. Finally, I turned the key, drove home to the house I had polished, cooked in, loved in, and for the first time in my life, it felt less like home and more like a battlefield. I brewed a pot of tea, though I didn't drink it. I just needed the ritual, boiling water, spooning leaves, setting a cup on the saucer the way my mother had taught me. The kitchen still smelled like the pound cake I'd baked that morning for Patrice's celebration. I stared at it on the counter, untouched, and realized celebration had curdled into mourning. But I also realized something else. Henry thought he had blindsided me, thought he'd walked out of that dinner with the upper hand, parading his mistress like a prize pig at a county fair. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I had already seen the storm clouds and I had already built myself a shelter. When you've lived long enough, you learn to see a storm before the rain ever hits the ground. Trouble has a way of showing its shadow first. Looking back now, I can see the shadows that crept into my marriage long before Henry opened his mouth at Patrice's graduation dinner. Henry and I met when I was 45. By then I'd been a widow for 7 years. My first husband, James, had been a good man, taken too early by a heart attack. We'd built a modest life together, and losing him near broke me. I poured myself into raising Patrice, into keeping a clean home, into church choir and Wednesday Bible study. Then Henry showed up. He was tall, sharp dresser, had a smile that made folks feel like he'd been waiting just for them. He courted me slow, brought flowers, took me to fish fries, sang bass behind me in the choir. My sister said he was too smooth, but I told myself maybe God was giving me a second chance at companionship. I was tired of lying down in a cold bed. For a long while, Henry treated me kindly. He worked steady, paid bills on time, prayed at dinner. Patrice was still young then, a teenager with eyes wide open. She never warmed to him the way I hoped, but she respected him. I told myself that was enough. We built a rhythm. I cooked Sunday dinners, collard greens, cornbread, baked macaroni, and he carved the ham. We planted rose bushes out front and sat on the porch sipping sweet tea. At least that's how it looked to the outside world. But inside, cracks were forming. Henry was the type who needed admiration like air. If folks weren't clapping for him, he grew restless. Over the years, I noticed him staying out later, saying he had business meetings or church committee work. I wanted to believe him. Lord knows I tried. But I could smell the cologne that wasn't his, the faint scent of perfume on his shirts. One evening, maybe 10 years into the marriage, I asked him plain, "Henry, where you been?" "You said you'd be home by 8. It's near midnight." He didn't flinch, just looked me in the eye and said, "Alma, you know I work hard." Sometimes it runs late. Don't start nagging me like I'm some boy. The sharpness of his tone stung more than the words. I swallowed it, told myself maybe I was being too suspicious. But suspicion doesn't fade. It lingers, heavy as humidity. There were other things, little things that added up. Bank withdrawals I didn't remember making, calls he took out on the porch, whispering low, a habit of turning his phone face down on the table. I wasn't naive. I had grown up around women who'd endured worse. My mother used to sit with her sisters on hot summer nights, fanning themselves on the porch, trading stories of men who strayed, drank too much, or lost their jobs. Their voices were tired but steady, like women who knew life would keep rolling, whether or not their men held steady. Still, betrayal feels different when it walks into your own kitchen. The first time I truly felt it was a Sunday afternoon. I had spent all morning in church, came home, fried chicken, made potato salad, had everything spread out nice. Henry walked in late, his tie loose, lips curved in that fake smile. He kissed my cheek, but his eyes looked past me, like I was part of the wallpaper. "Food's ready," I said. "I'm not hungry," he answered, grabbing his keys again. "Got a deacon's meeting." And just like that, he walked out, left the fried chicken cooling, the sweet tea sweating on the table, and me standing there with grease still popping in the skillet. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow. A voice in me whispered what I didn't want to name. He's with someone else. But I pressed it down. For Patrice's sake, for the life I thought we were still building, I pressed it down. The women at church weren't blind. Sister Ruth would squeeze my hand after service, searching my eyes. Mother Johnson once said, "Alma, you make sure you watching your house." Those words sat in me like a stone. It wasn't until Patrice went off to college that the cracks widened. With her gone, the house felt emptier, and Henry stopped pretending as much. Nights out stretched longer. He'd come home smelling like wine when he wasn't a drinker. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all, showing up in the morning with excuses polished and ready. I confronted him again. "Henry, I know you ain't at no meeting all night long." "Where are you?" He sighed, annoyed. "Why you always got to suspect the worst?" Can a man live his life without being interrogated? I wanted to shout. I wanted to throw the truth I already half knew in his face. But something in me chose silence. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of finding out just how deep the betrayal ran. Still, my silence didn't mean blindness. I started keeping my eyes open, storing away the signs, even if I wasn't ready to call them out. Because deep down, I knew. The storm was coming. The storm hit harder than I ever wanted to imagine. It was Patrice who finally forced my eyes open all the way. She came home one weekend during her junior year of college. I could tell something weighed heavy on her the minute she stepped through the door. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes darted at me like she was measuring how much truth I could handle. "Mama," she said finally, voice trembling, "I need to tell you something, but I don't want it to hurt you." The floor seemed to tilt under me. She sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd served meals on for the decades, and pulled out her phone. "I didn't go looking for this," she whispered, "but I saw Daddy, and I couldn't pretend like I didn't." On her screen, a picture glowed. Henry, arm around that same woman I'd later see at the graduation dinner. They were in a restaurant, laughing, holding hands like they didn't have a care in the world. Not like he had a wife at home. Not like he had a daughter paying tuition on loans and scholarships. My breath caught. I couldn't speak. "Mama," Patrice said softly, tears rolling down her cheeks. He was kissing her. In broad daylight, like he wanted people to see. I closed my eyes. My chest felt squeezed tight, like the air had been sucked out. I wanted to shield my daughter, tell her she misunderstood, but the evidence was right there, clear as a bell. I reached across the table, held her hand. "Thank you for telling me, baby," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You did right." That night, I waited up for Henry. He came strolling in close to midnight, whistling like a man without a care. I sat in the living room, the lamp casting a weak circle of light, waiting. "Evening, Alma," he said, loosening his tie. "You didn't have to wait up." "I wasn't waiting up," I answered. I was waiting. He frowned, confused, until I pulled out Patrice's phone and laid it on the coffee table. The picture of him and that woman stared back at us like an uninvited guest. Henry's face shifted quick. First shock, then annoyance, then that slick smirk he always wore when he thought he could talk his way out of anything. "So you spying on me now?" he said, "sending Patrice out to follow me?" "That's low, Alma." I blinked at him, hardly believing his nerve. "Don't you dare put this on her." "That girl stumbled across the truth you've been hiding. You ashamed enough to hide it, but bold enough to flaunt it in public?" He shrugged, sitting back like he was the victim. "You don't understand, Alma. She listens to me. She makes me feel alive again. You just... Everything with you is duty and routine." His words sliced. I'd built my life around keeping a home, cooking meals, paying bills, holding him steady when his job stressed him. Now that was routine? I felt heat rise in my chest, but I didn't let it show. My mama used to say, "Don't wrestle a pig, Alma. Both of you'll get dirty, but only the pig enjoys it." So I sat straighter, folding my hands in my lap. "If you've been unhappy, Henry, you should have said so. But sneaking behind my back, using our money to fund your little sideshow? That's not just betrayal, that's theft." His eyes flickered. Just a moment, but enough. And right there, I saw it. This wasn't only about another woman. He had been dipping into our savings. "Don't you worry about money," he muttered. "I've got everything under control." but I knew that look, that tightness around his mouth. Henry was lying. The next morning while he showered, I checked the drawer where we kept our joint statements. Several envelopes were missing. My stomach sank. I drove down to the bank that afternoon, asked to see the accounts. The teller's polite smile couldn't hide the truth. Withdrawals had been made. Thousands. I left the bank with papers in my purse and a knot in my chest. That night, Henry swaggered in like nothing was wrong, whistling the same tune. He kissed my cheek as if we hadn't fought the night before. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I made supper, cleared the plates, and all the while my mind worked quiet as a sewing needle. I understood then. Henry wasn't just stepping out on me. He was trying to step over me, take the life I'd built and pour it into somebody else's cup. That's when I started copying. Receipts, statements, every scrap of evidence I could find. I bought a little flash drive small enough to slip in my pocket, and every night when Henry fell asleep, I uploaded files. Quiet as a prayer, steady as a drumbeat. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, but I knew this much. If he thought he could strip me of my home, my savings, and my dignity, he had underestimated the wrong woman. The storm had broken. But I wasn't about to be swept away. When folks talk about betrayal, they make it sound like a single moment, a knife in the back, a sudden collapse. But the truth is slower, heavier. Betrayal is a drip. You don't drown in one drop. You drown in the flood. By the time I uncovered the missing money, I realized I had two choices: rage or strategy. Rage might have felt good for an evening, but it wouldn't protect my future, and it wouldn't secure Patrice's. Strategy, though, that was survival. So I chose strategy. That little flash drive became my secret weapon. Every night while Henry snored beside me, I slipped out of bed and opened the laptop in the den. My hands shook at first, part fear, part anger. But the more files I copied, the steadier I grew. Bank statements, credit card charges, hotel receipts tucked inside business trip folders, even emails, love notes he thought he'd hidden in some private account. It all went onto that flash drive, piece by piece. I was stitching together the truth. I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. One Sunday after church, I asked my neighbor, Sister Claudia, if she knew a trustworthy lawyer. Claudia worked in city offices for years and had seen enough mess to know who handled things quiet but firm. She scribbled down a name: Mr. Lawrence Green. I called him the next day. His voice was steady, low, with the kind of patience that comes from dealing with too many broken marriages. When I walked into his office, he stood, shook my hand, and said, "Mrs. Carter, tell me what's troubling you." I slid the flash drive across his desk. "This," I said, my voice flat, "and the man I married." He plugged it in, scrolled through folders, his eyebrows lifted. "You've been thorough." "Most clients bring me suspicions. You brought me evidence." "I'm too old for suspicions," I told him. "I need to protect my house, my retirement, my daughter's inheritance." Henry thinks he's walking out with everything. I intend to see he walks out with nothing but what belongs to him, and no more. Mr. Green leaned back in his chair. "Then we'll build this case brick by brick. You'll need to stay quiet, though. No fights at home, no warnings, let him think you're in the dark. That was the hardest part, playing blind while my eyes were wide open." Henry strutted around the house like a rooster, humming when he shaved, checking his phone with that secret grin. He thought he was untouchable, and I let him think it. One evening, as I was folding laundry, he walked into the bedroom, shirt unbuttoned, smelling faintly of some woman's perfume. "You know," he said casually, "I've been thinking about putting the house on the market." Too much for us to keep up with. We could rent somewhere smaller. I folded one more towel before answering. You might be right." Inside, my stomach clenched. That house wasn't just walls and floors. It was my life's work, my sanctuary. I had cleaned every corner, baked every holiday meal in that kitchen, prayed in that living room when grief sat heavy on me. The idea of losing it to his foolishness felt like losing my own heartbeat. But on the outside, I smiled faintly and nodded, as though his plan made sense. I remembered what Mr. Green told me. Don't let him know he's already lost. The very next day, I signed papers with Green to secure my ownership rights. We filed motions to freeze joint accounts, to trace every withdrawal he'd made. The house went under protective notice. He couldn't touch it without my consent. Henry didn't know any of this. He thought his secret meetings and hidden withdrawals were invisible. The third confrontation came 1 week later. We sat at the dinner table, fried catfish and cornbread between us. He leaned back in his chair, that smirk tugging at his lips. "Alma, I don't want to hurt you, but you need to understand I can't stay tied down. I've found happiness elsewhere." I laid my fork down gently, folded my napkin. My heart was pounding, but my voice was calm. "Henry, I know everything." For the first time, his smirk faltered. "What do you mean?" "I know about her. I know about the money. I know about the lies you tell when you think I'm asleep." His face darkened. He expected tears, maybe a shouting match. Instead, I just looked at him, steady and quiet. "You've wasted enough of my time," I said softly, "but you won't waste my future." He barked a laugh, though it rang hollow. "Alma, you think you've got power in this?" "Please, you've got nothing. I'll walk away with what I want." I picked up my fork again, cut a piece of fish, and tasted it slow. "If that's what you believe," I murmured, "then I'll let you keep believing it." His eyes narrowed, suspicious, but he didn't press. And I sat there, chewing calmly, knowing he had no idea the ground was already crumbling beneath his feet. If Henry had been a snake coiled in the grass before, now he was striking in the open. Once he realized I wouldn't crumble at the mention of happiness elsewhere, his tactics changed. He started pressing harder, trying to shove me out of the life we'd built as though I were a tenant who'd overstayed her welcome. It began with Patrice. One Saturday afternoon, she came by to help me trim hedges. She looked troubled, and I knew it wasn't just the yard work. "Mama," she said, "Daddy's been calling me, saying you're being difficult." I set my clippers down, turned to her. "What exactly did he say?" Her voice trembled. "He told me you're bitter, that you don't want him to be happy, that you're trying to ruin him financially. He said maybe he should have left sooner." The hurt in her eyes cut me deep. It was one thing for Henry to betray me, but to drag our daughter into his lies? That was cruelty. I held her hands in mine. "Baby, listen to me. I won't ever put you in the middle of this, but don't let your daddy's words confuse you. A man who's walking away will say anything to make himself the victim. You know who I am. You've seen how I live." She squeezed my hands back, tears brimming. "I know, Mama." I told him I'm grown enough to see the truth for myself. Her loyalty gave me strength, but Henry wasn't finished. The following week, I received a notice in the mail, a petition to sell the house. My heart raced. But when I called Mr. Green, he chuckled low. "Don't worry, Mrs. Carter. That petition won't stand. He can't sell what you've already locked down. Let him file papers until his fingers cramp. He's boxed in." Still, I couldn't ignore the sting. That house wasn't just property. It was a living archive. Every photo on the wall, every scratch in the hardwood floors told our story. My roses out front had roots deeper than Henry's loyalty had ever been. The thought of him trying to trade it away for a quick profit made me want to weep and scream all at once. Instead, I baked. I spent that whole afternoon rolling out biscuit dough, slow and deliberate, letting the flour dust my hands. Cooking has always been my balm, my weapon. By the time the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and yeast, my anger had cooled into resolve. But Henry pressed on. He started flaunting that woman in public. I heard from church sisters that he'd been spotted at restaurants, holding her hand bold as day. Folks stopped me after service, their eyes soft with pity. Some whispered, "Stay strong, Mother Carter." Others, like Sister Ruth, hugged me tight and said, "God don't sleep, Alma." He don't sleep. I wore my best hat that Sunday, walked into church tall, humming the hymn under my breath. If Henry wanted to humiliate me, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hanging my head. At night, though, I lay awake, listening to the tick of the clock. Fear tried to creep in. Fear of losing my security. Fear of ending up alone with nothing but an empty house and a broken heart. But then I remembered my grandmother. She raised 9 children in a shotgun house in Mississippi with nothing but grit and a garden. I remembered my mother, who scrubbed white folks' floors so I could have a school uniform. Those women had survived worse storms than mine. They fought too hard, I whispered into the dark, too hard for me to hand my legacy over to a fool. And so every insult Henry hurled, every maneuver he tried only strengthened my resolve. When he threw a smirk across the dinner table saying, "Alma, you might as well make this easy, sign the papers," I smiled faintly and said, "Henry, you always were impatient. You'll see patience pays better." He thought I was bluffing. He thought my calm was weakness. But behind that calm was fire. Behind that calm were locked accounts, legal filings, and a flash drive full of truths sharp enough to cut him down. The man didn't realize yet that the harder he pushed, the more he exposed his own cracks. And I was just waiting for the right moment to let the whole world see them. The thing about a man like Henry is he believes the whole world will clap for him forever. But applause always fades. And when it did, he was left standing on stage alone, with nothing but the sound of his own foolishness echoing back. It started with the mistress. Word trickled through town faster than spilled sugar on a countertop. She was growing impatient. My niece saw them in the mall parking lot, her finger poking hard in his chest, her voice raised sharp enough to cut glass. Later, Patrice told me, "Mama, she was hollering about money," saying he promised her a condo, a car, all this nonsense. I just nodded, kept stirring my pot of gumbo. My daughter's eyes studied me, searching for anger, but I felt none. I'd already seen the bank freezes, the court filings. I knew what that woman didn't. Henry didn't have 2 nickels left to rub together without my name on the account. She had hitched herself to a sinking ship. Around the same time, whispers at church shifted. Folks who once looked at me with pity now looked at me with respect. It wasn't because I spread tales. Lord knows I kept my tongue. But truth has a way of walking into a room on its own 2 feet. People saw Henry's absence, saw his boldness parading that woman, and they drew their own conclusions. One Sunday after service, Pastor's wife pulled me aside. "Mother Carter," she said softly, "you carry yourself with grace. Don't you worry. Everybody sees who kept the vows and who broke them." Those words laid balm on my spirit. Respect was something Henry couldn't steal. At home, the tension mounted. Henry grew sharper, more frustrated. He'd slam doors, stomp around muttering about lawyers, about how I was ruining him. I'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping tea, watching him unravel like a cheap sweater. "Alma, Mum," he snapped one evening, "you're turning Patrice against me." I looked up from my teacup, steady. "No, Henry, you did that yourself." His face flushed red, but he said nothing more. A week later, we had our first mediation meeting. Henry strutted in with that woman on his arm, bold as ever, like she was entitled to sit in the same room where our marriage was being dismantled. My lawyer, Mr. Green, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I kept my eyes on the papers in front of me. Henry leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Let's make this easy. I'll take the house, half the savings, and we'll call it even." I almost laughed, but instead I clasped my hands together on the table and let Mr. Green do the talking. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "your request is noted. But before we discuss division, the court needs to review some evidence." He plugged in the flash drive. The room went quiet except for the click of the mouse. Folder after folder opened. Bank transfers to accounts in Henry's name only. Payments for hotel rooms, gifts purchased and shipped to another address. And then the emails, sweet nothings written to the mistress, promising her vacations and jewelry paid for out of funds that were half mine. The mistress shifted in her seat, her smile slipping. Henry's smirk died altogether. "What is this?" he stammered. "Evidence," Mr. Green answered simply. The mediator's face stayed neutral, but her pen scratched furiously on the pad in front of her. By the time the session ended, the balance of power had shifted completely. Henry realized too late that the house was untouchable, the accounts frozen, the evidence stacked against him like bricks in a wall. That evening, Patrice called me, her voice almost breathless. "Mama, I heard." Daddy looked like a fool today. I didn't gloat. I just said, "Baby, truth has a way of standing tall even when lies try to bury it." Meanwhile, the mistress disappeared. She stopped showing up with Henry at dinners, stopped parading around on his arm. Last I heard, she had packed up and left, angry at promises broken and money dried up. Henry, stripped of both his pride and his prize, started calling my phone late at night. "Alma, can we talk?" he'd plead. "We don't have to do this in court. We can settle between us." I let the calls go to voicemail. Dignity means knowing when silence speaks louder than words. By the time our next court date rolled around, Henry looked smaller, shoulders hunched, suit wrinkled, eyes dark from sleepless nights. The mistress was nowhere to be seen, and I sat there, hat pinned neatly, pearls at my neck, calm as a still pond, because I knew the second twist had already struck. His world was falling apart, and all I had done was stand still and let the truth catch up with him. The last court date came on a gray morning in early spring. Clouds hung low, heavy with rain, but I felt light as I buttoned my coat. Patrice insisted on driving me, her hand warm on mine as we rode in silence. "Mama," she whispered when we pulled up to the courthouse, "today is the day." "I can feel it." I nodded, breathing deep. My heart was steady. The storm outside couldn't touch the calm inside me. Henry sat on the other side of the courtroom, shoulders slouched, tie crooked. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 months. The mistress wasn't there. She had slipped out of his life as quick as she had entered, leaving him with nothing but debts and disappointment. The judge cleared her throat, shuffling papers. "We are here to finalize the division of assets in the matter of Carter versus Carter." Mr. Green stood tall, his voice smooth as butter. He laid out everything: the withdrawals, the secret spending, the mistress. He showed the flash drive evidence with precision, each file a nail in the coffin of Henry's credibility. Henry tried to object, stammering about how I was vindictive, how I wanted to see him suffer, but the judge silenced him with one firm tap of her gavel. "Mr. Carter, the evidence here speaks louder than your claims," she said sharply. "You misused marital funds for personal gain. You attempted to liquidate assets without your wife's consent. You endangered her financial security after decades of marriage. That will not be overlooked." Her words rang like church bells. Then she turned to me. "Mrs. Carter, your diligence and documentation have protected your interests. You will retain the house, the majority of retirement savings, and all personal assets accumulated jointly. Mr. Carter will be held responsible for repaying funds misused from joint accounts." The gavel came down with a crack. It was finished. Henry's face crumpled. Shock, anger, shame all twisted together. He turned to me, his voice a whisper meant only for my ears. "Alma, you've ruined me." I looked him in the eye, steady as stone. "No, Henry. You ruined yourself. I just stopped you from dragging me down with you." He swallowed hard, but said nothing more. As we walked out of the courtroom, Patrice squeezed my arm. "Mama, you did it. You stood your ground." I smiled faintly. "Baby, sometimes standing still is the strongest thing you can do." The days that followed felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. The house was quiet, yes, but it was mine. My roses bloomed that spring, red and full, as if they too were celebrating freedom. Neighbors waved when I passed, their smiles warmer than before. At church, folks greeted me not with pity, but with respect. I could feel it in their hugs, their words. They had watched me walk through fire without letting it consume me. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen, apron tied around my waist, biscuits rising in the oven. The smell filled the air, comforting as a hymn. I thought of all the years I had spent cooking for a man who took me for granted, and I smiled, not with bitterness, but with peace. Because those meals weren't wasted. They had nourished me, Patrice, and the home I fought to keep. The love I poured into that house was still alive, still mine. As for Henry, word was he moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Folks said he looked worn down, lonely. Some whispered he tried to call the mistress back, but she wanted nothing to do with a man who had no money left to spend. Poetic justice, I thought. The final confrontation wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the silence that followed, in the way the world kept spinning, while Henry sat in the ruins of his choices. And me? I kept moving forward, hosting Sunday dinners again, laughing with Patrice, tending my roses, sitting in the front pew at church with my hat pinned high. I had not only survived betrayal, I had turned it into a shield, protecting my home, my legacy, and my dignity. And every time I passed by the mantel and saw the flash drive tucked safely in a little box, I remembered. Sometimes the smallest things carry the heaviest truths. Betrayal doesn't vanish just because the court signs papers. It lingers, like smoke after a fire. Some nights I still wake and turn, half expecting Henry's breathing beside me. But when I find only the soft quiet of my room, I remind myself that silence is freedom, not loss. In the months after the divorce, I had to learn how to live in my own skin again. For 42 years, I'd been Henry's wife. Folks called us a unit, like salt and pepper shakers always paired together. But now, when people spoke my name, it stood on its own, Alma Louise Carter. At first, the solitude cut sharp. Mornings felt empty without the shuffle of his feet in the hallway. I kept waiting to hear his keys drop in the bowl by the door, his humming as he shaved. Funny how even the habits of someone who hurt you can echo like comfort when they're gone. But slowly, I filled that silence with better sounds. Patrice calling, "Mama, what's for dinner?" Neighbors stopping by to sit on the porch, sipping sweet tea. The choir's harmonies drifting into my soul during Wednesday rehearsals. Life didn't end with Henry's betrayal. It stretched wider, like a quilt unfolding, making room for new patterns. I poured myself into the house with fresh eyes, painted the kitchen walls a soft yellow, the kind of warmth I had always wanted but never insisted on. I planted new rose bushes out front, each bloom a declaration that I was still standing. When the petals opened, I thought of my grandmother's words, "Flowers grow stronger when storms pass over them." The community wrapped around me, too. At church, folks began asking me to speak at women's gatherings, not to preach, but to share, to tell the truth about resilience, about dignity in the face of betrayal. The first time I stood in front of them, hands trembling, I said, "Don't you ever let someone else's lies steal your truth. Don't you ever let their betrayal write your ending. You can stand tall, even when your heart is breaking, and when you stand tall, the storm has no choice but to pass." The women nodded, tears shining in their eyes. Some hugged me afterward, whispering about their own troubles, their own secret hurts. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine. It was a light for others still walking through darkness. And what of Henry? Word drifted through the grapevine, as it always does. He was seen sitting alone at diners, shoulders hunched. Some said he tried to charm another woman, but his swagger had withered. Without money, without reputation, he was just another man who'd squandered what mattered most. I never gloated, not out loud. But in the quiet of my kitchen, with my hands dusted in flour, I'd whisper, "You see, Henry? The truth will always outlast the lies." One evening, Patrice came by with her 2 little ones. They ran through the living room, laughter bouncing off the walls. Patrice hugged me and said, "Mama, I'm proud of you. You taught me what strength looks like." Her words settled in my chest like a hymn. That was my true victory. Not the house, not the savings, not even the court ruling. It was knowing I had protected my daughter's inheritance of dignity. She saw her mother stand, unbroken, and she would carry that with her long after I was gone. Now, when I sit on my porch at dusk, the cicadas humming, I think about freedom. Not the kind Henry toasted that night at Patrice's graduation dinner, the shallow freedom of running toward lust and lies, but the deeper freedom of knowing I answered betrayal with truth, with patience, with strategy. The deeper freedom of knowing I didn't let bitterness rot me from the inside. Sometimes, in those quiet moments, I remember the flash drive. That little piece of plastic held the weight of my deliverance. I keep it tucked away, not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me that even small, hidden truths can change the course of a life. In the end, I realized betrayal isn't the end of a story. It's the test that reveals who you are when everything else is stripped away. And I, Alma Louise Carter, passed mine. So when I look back at that night, the clink of Henry's glass, the smug grin on his face, the mistress smiling bold across the table, I can still hear my own whisper. Congratulations, you just failed your last test. Only now I add one more thought, soft as a prayer, and I passed mine.